When the Thompson family started tearing down the old fireplace at 512 in Elmwood Street, Charleston, they had no idea what they were about to uncover. Behind the crumbling bricks lay a secret that had been hidden for over a decade: a human body. In that instant, a quiet Sunday afternoon turned into a chilling discovery, and their home became a crime scene. Michael Thompson's sledgehammer swung through the air again, each crack of brick echoing through the high ceilings of the Elmwood Street living room. Dust filled the space, settling over the polished hardwood floors like a pale fog, and Emma, standing near the doorway with their 8-year-old son, Liam, clutched the edge of her cardigan, eyes wide. The house was beautiful and old Charleston Victorian, its walls lined with the kind of moldings and wooden details that whispered of decades past, but it was worn, tired, hiding secrets behind layers of paint and wallpaper. They had moved in 6 months ago, lured by charm, history, and the promise of a family home, but the fireplace had always bothered Michael. It hadn't worked in years, and every winter, the empty hearth reminded him of what the house was missing. The contractor's estimate had been steep, $3,000 just to remove a blockage that might be nothing more than old debris or nests. So Michael had decided to tackle it himself. The thrill of dye, coupled with a frugal streak, seemed harmless enough until the bricks began to fall, revealing something that shouldn't have been there. At first, the smell was subtle, almost like a forgotten closet left sealed for years, but as more bricks tumbled, it turned sharp and wrong. Michael froze mid-swing, chest tightening. Emma saw the color drain from his face, saw the way his hands trembled despite his grip on the sledgehammer. "Michael, what is it?" she asked, her voice caught between disbelief and fear. Michael didn't answer. He lowered the hammer and leaned forward, peering into the hollow that had opened up behind the facade of the fireplace. Shapes emerged from the shadows, dimly illuminated by the flashlight he had grabbed from the kitchen. At first, he tried to rationalize it: construction debris, a rolled-up rug, anything that would make sense. But what he saw didn't make sense. A shoe, old and dusty, sticking out at an unnatural angle, then fabric-worn denim, crumpled and still holding the form of something human. A shiver ran down his spine. His stomach lurched. He backed away, dropping the hammer to the floor with a clatter that made Emma jump. Her voice shook as she whispered, "Michael, what is it?" He could barely speak. "Get out," he said, the words hoarse, hollow even to him. He ushered Emma and Liam toward the front door, fumbling with the lock as his mind raced. There was no mistaking it now. Human remains lay concealed inside the fireplace, sealed behind decades of brick and mortar, hidden with purpose. A quiet Sunday afternoon had turned into the beginning of a nightmare. One that would not only disrupt their lives, but ripple through years of unanswered questions and forgotten histories. Outside, Michael paced the front yard, brushing dust from his sleeves, watching the familiar street transform into a stage for the unknown. Neighbors were still out, tending gardens, walking dogs, completely unaware of what had just been uncovered behind the walls of number 512. The sun streamed through the magnolia trees lining Elmwood Street, beautiful and indifferent. A sharp contrast to the darkness they had found inside their own home. Emma called 911, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped the phone. Liam clutched her leg, asking questions that couldn't be answered, sensing the fear that neither parent could hide. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, but even through the clarity of protocol, the gravity of the situation settled over them like a weight. "Please step away from the house and do not touch anything," the operator instructed. By the time the first officers arrived, the living room looked more like a crime scene than a home in the middle of a quiet neighborhood. White gloves, notepads, cameras, and measuring tape replaced the domestic familiarity of couch cushions and family photos. Michael and Emma were led to their car, sitting tensely, watching strangers dismantle the very hearth that brought warmth and comfort just hours before. Through the window, he could see the methodical work of officers, photographers, and eventually forensic experts. Every careful brick removed, every measurement taken, made the reality more undeniable. Behind those walls, someone had been hidden for years, and the idea that a human life had been reduced to that quiet, suffocating Tom was almost too much to bear. Questions swirled in Michael's mind with an almost painful velocity. How long had the remains been there? Who had done this? What kind of person could commit such an act and leave it concealed for so long, passing ownership and life as though nothing had happened? The curiosity mingled with horror, and though he tried to focus on the present, the children, the responding officers, the safety of his family, his thoughts inevitably drifted to the unknown life that had been trapped in those bricks, and the life that must have been full of plans, hopes, and a future now stolen. When the coroner arrived in the black van, Michael felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The black body bag, silent and unyielding, seemed impossibly heavy in its presence alone, a physical manifestation of all the unanswered questions. The officers were efficient, professional, but there was a hush, a tension in the air. A quiet understanding that the ordinary fabric of life had been violently disrupted. Michael held Emma's hand, squeezing tightly, a silent promise that he would protect their son from the fear and the horror. Liam clung to her leg, too young to fully grasp the situation, but not too young to sense the fear radiating from the adults around him. As the day wore on, Michael could not stop thinking about the history of the house, about the people who had lived there, the secrets it had kept. An empty Victorian home with its polished floors and decorative moldings suddenly felt like a monument to silence, concealment, and the darkness that sometimes hides behind familiar doors. The fireplace, once a symbol of warmth and family gatherings, had become a window into a decade-old crime. A reminder that beneath the veneer of everyday life, some truths wait silently, patiently, for someone to stumble upon them. Michael and Emma would not be able to sleep that night, nor would the nights that followed. Every creak of the old floorboards, every shadow in the corner of a room, every draft from the chimney would remind them that their discovery had changed the house forever. The knowledge that someone's life had ended inside the hearth, hidden from the world for so long, was not something that faded easily. Yet, despite the horror, there was a strange gravity to the discovery and awareness that even in tragedy, truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how long it was buried. And so, as night fell over Charleston, the Thompsons sat in the front yard, wrapped in blankets against the chill. The fireplace standing silent behind them, a dark secret finally brought to light, and a story that would unravel far beyond the walls of 5000 Elmwood Street. Emma Thompson felt her heart hammering in her chest as she watched Michael step back from the fireplace, his face pale and tight with disbelief. The morning light fell through the tall windows of their Charleston living room, dust motes dancing lazily in the sunbeams. But nothing about the scene was ordinary anymore. Liam clutched at her legs, sensing the tension in the air even if he couldn't name it. Michael's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and hoarse, more a whisper of command than a conversation. "Step away," he said, his eyes locked on the dark cavity behind the brick. There was a weight in the room that pressed against their ribs, an invisible force that demanded caution. Emma didn't hesitate. She pulled Liam toward the front door, careful not to look back, though the impulse to see what had been uncovered was almost overwhelming. The street outside seemed to go on as if nothing had changed. Birds hopped along the magnolia trees, cars drove past, neighbors waved casually from porches. All of it contrasted sharply with the horror that had been revealed inside their home. Emma gripped the phone in her hand and dialed 911, her fingers shaking so badly she had to pause twice to steady them. She could feel Liam trembling against her, and though she wanted to comfort him, she knew there was nothing she could do to shield him from what was happening. She spoke quickly, almost stumbling over words, explaining the situation to the operator. The words tumbling out in a rush, a discovery in the fireplace, something wrong, possibly human remains. The dispatcher's calm, measured voice seemed distant, almost dreamlike, but it grounded her just enough to continue following instructions. They were to stay outside, not touch anything, and wait for help. Michael stood a few feet away, his hands pressed into his jeans pockets, the sledgehammer abandoned on the porch. His mind was spinning. The house had seemed so ordinary, so familiar, yet in that moment it had become alien, a stage for something incomprehensible. His gaze kept flicking back to the living room, to the dark hollow behind the bricks. And though he knew they had been instructed not to interfere, the urge to go back, to see more, gnawed at him relentlessly. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. The reality of what they had found, a human body, hidden for years, pressed on him with a weight that made his knees ache. The sound of sirens in the distance made Emma squeeze Liam a little tighter, though it offered only partial relief. Officers arrived quickly, stepping out of their cars with a quiet urgency, radios crackling with information. Michael and Emma explained what had happened, their voices shaking, and watched as the professionals took over with precision. Cameras flashed, notebooks opened, and gloves went on as they approached the fireplace. Michael felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. Relief that trained eyes were now handling the situation. Fear for what they might find and what it could mean for them. Time became distorted. Minutes stretched into hours as officers carefully dismantled the brickwork, taking photographs and measurements, documenting every fragment of evidence. Michael and Emma sat on the curb, Liam nestled against his mother, watching strangers transform their home into a scene of meticulous investigation. Each piece of brick removed revealed more of the hollow space, more of the reality that had been hidden for over a decade. The mind struggled to make sense of it, to reconcile the familiar warmth of the living room with the darkness that had been sealed inside for so long. As the day wore on, Emma found herself thinking about the life that had been concealed there, a life interrupted, frozen in time. Who had been trapped in that fireplace? How had no one noticed? How many people had walked through the house, unaware of the secret it held? The questions multiplied, each one more pressing than the last. And she realized the answers might never fully come without the painstaking work of investigators. Michael's hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white, his jaw rigid. He couldn't stop replaying the moment he had swung the hammer, the second he realized what he had uncovered. That single instant had transformed an ordinary day into a collision with history, with human tragedy, and with secrets too long hidden. When the coroner arrived, the weight of the situation became tangible. The black van, the officers' expressions, the methodical removal of remains, it was all unmistakable now. Michael felt a wave of nausea, a physical reaction to the knowledge of what had been uncovered. Emma reached over, squeezing his hand, and for a moment, the reality outside, the immediate horror, the sun, the street, the neighbors seemed almost absurd. The fireplace, which had once represented comfort and family gatherings, had become a tomb, a silent witness to events that had been deliberately concealed. Events that might never have been known if not for a sledgehammer and a desire to restore warmth. Even as investigators continued their work, documenting every detail, Emma and Michael were left to grapple with a personal horror. The house had been their sanctuary, the place where they had imagined birthdays, holidays, and quiet evenings together. Now it felt like a cage holding a memory of violence, a memory that would not leave. Liam, too young to comprehend, occasionally asked questions about what was happening, and each time, Emma would brush his hair back and force a calmness into her voice that she did not feel. "It's okay, honey," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. "The police are here, and everything will be all right." She didn't know if it was true. By late afternoon, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across Elmwood Street, and the house seemed to age before their eyes. Every detail, the ornate crown molding, the polished floors, the high ceilings, now carried a sense of foreboding. Michael and Emma found themselves unable to enter the house, unwilling to sit inside the very space where a life had been so callously hidden. They watched from the front yard as the coroner and officers methodically documented, lifted, and bagged evidence. The small human gestures, the careful folding of gloves, the deliberate attention to protocol stood in stark contrast to the horror of what had been discovered. And yet it was the only reassurance they had that the truth would be respected, that the hidden life would be acknowledged. Night fell, but sleep did not come. The sound of the old floorboards settling, the occasional creak of the front door, even the wind rustling through the magnolia trees, became reminders of the discovery, reminders of the fragility of what they had thought of as ordinary life. Michael stared out at the house, Emma beside him, Liam asleep between them in the back seat of their car, and felt the weight of history pressing down. The fireplace, once mundane, had become a symbol, a nexus of hidden stories and unfinished justice. The family had stumbled into a past that demanded recognition, and they could not retreat. The discovery had changed everything, altered the very rhythm of their lives, and as the first officers left, promising more to come, Michael and Emma understood that their days of ordinary life were over. The street remained quiet, almost defiantly ordinary, but 512 Elmwood Street would never be the same. Inside, layers of dust and decay had preserved a secret that demanded acknowledgement. Outside, the Thompsons sat in the cold, holding each other, holding Liam, realizing that the unfolding story was far larger than they could yet comprehend. The knowledge that a life had been hidden, silenced, and forgotten for more than a decade pressed upon them with relentless gravity. The day had begun like any other, but now they were witnesses to the echoes of the past, bearers of a truth that could not be ignored. And the story that had begun behind the fireplace was only just beginning to unravel. The arrival of the first officers marked the beginning of a new layer of reality for the Thompsons. Michael and Emma could only watch as men and women in uniform moved with precision, their presence imposing yet methodical, as though they had been trained to navigate the fragile space between horror and procedure. Cameras clicked and flashed, flashlights swept over the brickwork, and small notepads filled with careful, precise handwriting. Michael felt both relief and dread at the same time. Relief because professionals were now handling the situation, and dread because each movement, each brick removed, made the discovery more undeniable. Every piece of rubble revealed was a step deeper into a story that had been silenced for too long. A story that the Thompsons had stumbled upon by accident, but could never escape. Emma stayed close to Liam, shielding him with her body as best she could. His small hands gripped the fabric of her shirt, eyes wide and unblinking, and she found herself explaining only the smallest fragments of truth. "The police are taking care of everything," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. She didn't mention the body, not in detail, not yet. Michael's jaw tightened, and he nodded once, appreciating her attempt to protect their son, even while knowing that the knowledge of what had been hidden inside the fireplace would inevitably leave its mark. By the time the coroner arrived, the sun had shifted low in the Charleston sky, casting long shadows across Elmwood Street. The black van and the somber professionalism of the coroner's team gave form to the unthinkable reality inside the Thompson home. Michael felt a wave of nausea as he watched the black bag being carried from the living room, and he realized in a chilling moment how fragile the line was between everyday life and the extraordinary horrors it could conceal. Emma's hand on his shoulder was a tether to the present, a reminder that they were still living, still responsible for each other and for Liam. But the weight of the past, of a life that had been ended and hidden, pressed upon them like a physical force. Neighbors began to notice the commotion. A few ventured closer, peeking over the top of hedges and fences, whispering and speculating about what might have occurred. Their everyday concerns, mail, garden chores. The rhythm of ordinary weekend life suddenly seemed absurd in the face of the dark reality unfolding at number 512. Michael and Emma ignored them, focusing instead on the task of holding themselves together for their son, for each other, and for the realization that their home had become the center of an investigation into something much larger than they could yet comprehend. As officers continued to dismantle the fireplace piece by piece, Michael's mind wandered to the history of the house. He thought of all the families who had lived there before, the children who had played in the sunlit living room, the quiet nights by the hearth that had never really existed, the laughter and warmth that might have been replaced by the silent tragedy hidden in the bricks. He tried to imagine the life that had ended there, the person who had been trapped, the choices that had led to such a cruel and deliberate concealment. Every crack of a brick against the floor seemed to echo with questions that had waited years, perhaps decades, for answers. Emma found herself unable to stop thinking about the human aspect of what had been uncovered. She tried to picture the life of the person behind the fireplace, their hopes, their routines, the ordinary moments that had once defined them. It was impossible not to feel the weight of the injustice, the long span of time that had allowed a crime to remain hidden. She realized how close they had come to living beside a secret that would have gone undetected forever, a reminder of how fragile and deceptive appearances could be. Hours passed. The coroner and forensic team worked with a meticulous patience that both reassured and tormented the Thompsons. Michael and Emma alternated between pacing the yard and sitting silently on the curb, unable to relax, unable to imagine that the day would ever return to normal. Every sound from the house, the scrape of a tool, the soft thump of falling brick, the faint murmur of voices coordinating reinforced the reality of the discovery. Liam finally curled into Emma's side, exhausted by the tension and the unspoken questions, and she held him close, wishing she could offer comfort beyond words. By late afternoon, as the light softened into the warm tones of evening, the nature of the discovery became more tangible. The coroner carefully examined the remains, confirming the worst fears: a human life had been deliberately hidden and preserved in a space designed to hold warmth and fire, now transformed into a tomb. Michael's stomach churned at the thought of the meticulous planning it must have taken, the cold deliberation behind the act that had gone unnoticed for so long. Emma struggled with a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and a growing resolve to understand, to witness, to remember. The house, once a symbol of promise and domestic comfort, had become a place where time collapsed, where the past pressed in on the present with unrelenting weight. Michael and Emma felt that they were participants in a story that had begun long before their arrival, one that had been written in silence, dust, and stone. The fireplace, once a center of imagined warmth and family gatherings, had become a portal to a tragedy neither of them could have predicted, a marker of human cruelty and secrecy that could no longer be ignored. As darkness fell over Elmwood Street, the Thompsons remained outside, wrapped in blankets against the evening chill. The police had secured the scene, but no one could restore the ordinary sense of home. Each shadow from the surrounding trees, each flicker of streetlight through the windows, carried the weight of what had been uncovered. Michael and Emma understood that the rest of their lives in that house would be haunted by the discovery, by the knowledge that a life had been stolen and concealed behind a veneer of normalcy. Even as they tried to imagine a return to ordinary routines, the memory of the bricks, the shape of the hollow, and then the knowledge of what had been inside would not leave them. They felt the responsibility of bearing witness, of acknowledging a life that had been erased from ordinary record, and the moral weight of having stumbled upon it. Michael glanced at Emma, and though they could not yet speak fully about the depth of their shock, they shared a silent understanding. They had uncovered something extraordinary and terrible, something that demanded attention, reflection, and ultimately, justice. The night deepened, and the neighborhood settled into its typical quiet, unaware of the dark truth revealed inside number 512. Michael and Emma, sitting side by side with Liam between them, understood that their discovery was only the beginning. The story that had been hidden in the bricks and mortar was about to unfold further, as investigators worked to uncover the identity of the person, the circumstances of the concealment, and the chain of events that had led to a life being ended and erased from memory. The Thompsons had entered a narrative that belonged to someone else, but now they were inseparable from it, witnesses to a truth too long buried. and participants in the unraveling of a decade-old secret. By the following morning, the reality of the discovery had begun to settle in, though it offered no comfort. Michael and Emma sat at the kitchen table, the phone in Emma's hand, listening to the dispatcher's instructions again. Officers would return later with forensic specialists, and the coroner had already scheduled a preliminary examination. Even in the soft morning light, the house seemed different, heavier somehow, burdened by the knowledge of what lay within the walls. Michael tried to recall the last time the fireplace had actually worked, but the memory felt distant, surreal. Every detail, the decorative tiles, the old mantel, the carved molding now seemed ominous, as if it had been waiting all along to reveal the hidden truth. For Michael and Emma, the waiting was unbearable. They paced the front yard, hesitant to enter the house, hesitant to leave it behind entirely. The officers had made it clear that nothing inside could be disturbed until they had completed their examination. Still, Michael's mind raced, imagining scenarios, thinking of every possible explanation. Yet none of them could make sense of the horror that had been exposed. He glanced at Liam, who sat quietly on the curb, fidgeting with his shoelaces. A child's innocence, untouched by the complexities of tragedy, but nevertheless sensitive to the tension radiating from his parents. Michael felt an overwhelming desire to shield him, to preserve some fragment of normalcy in a world that had suddenly become anything but. When the forensic team arrived, they worked with a precision that was almost hypnotic. Every tool, every movement, every photograph was part of a carefully choreographed procedure that underscored the seriousness of the situation. Michael and Em observed from a distance, their presence acknowledged but largely ignored by the professionals who treated the fireplace as both Evans and a Tom. The coroner, a tall, solemn woman with a black van parked out front, moved with deliberate care, the black bag she carried seeming to absorb all light and attention in the yard. Michael swallowed hard as he watched her step lightly through the doorway, disappear into the living room, and re-emerge with the grim confirmation of their worst fears. Questions gnawed at Michael relentlessly. How had no one noticed the body for so long? Who had placed it there? What had been the life that ended behind those bricks? And why had it been concealed with such careful intent? He tried to imagine the person inside, the moments leading up to their death, the fear and confusion that must have accompanied them in their final hours. It was impossible not to feel a surge of anger mixed with sorrow, a bitter cocktail that left his stomach churning. Emma sat close, offering quiet comfort, though neither could fully articulate the weight pressing down upon them. They had discovered something extraordinary, something beyond the mundane concerns of a new home or weekend renovations. They had uncovered a story of human life interrupted, silenced, and hidden away. By mid-afternoon, the street outside Elmwood had begun to fill with curious neighbors, drawn by the flashing lights and whispered speculations. Michael and Emma remained seated on the curb, feeling both protective and vulnerable. It was a strange mixture of emotions, knowing that their private discovery had become a public spectacle, and yet understanding that the presence of law enforcement was necessary. The forensic team moved efficiently, documenting every detail: the angle of the bricks, the layer of dust, the faint traces of decay and age. Each piece of evidence added to a narrative that stretched back years, a story written in silence and neglect, now demanding recognition. When the coroner returned, Michael felt a wave of vertigo. The black body bag, the careful gloved hands, the deliberate attention to every step all underscored the permanence of what had been found. Emma's hand found his, gripping tightly, and for a moment, they shared a quiet connection amid the chaos. Liam, sensing the gravity of the moment even without understanding it fully, pressed himself against his mother's side, eyes wide and still. The presence of their son was a reminder that life continued, that there was still a world beyond the horror inside the house. Yet it could not fully shield them from the knowledge of the discovery. Hours passed, marked by the meticulous work of investigators and the slow rotation of shadows across the Elmwood Street. Michael found his thoughts drifting repeatedly to the history of the house. Who had lived there before? What secrets had the walls kept? What lives had intersected within those rooms? Each brick removed was a small revelation, each photograph taken a testament to the gravity of what had been hidden. The house, with its familiar charm, had become a repository for past sins, and the Thompsons were now unwilling witnesses to its dark legacy. Even as the day wore on, Emma found herself drawn into contemplation of the person who had been concealed within the fireplace. She tried to imagine their life, their routines, their hopes, the ordinary moments that had once defined them. It was a mental exercise filled with grief, a meditation on absence and loss. And yet it brought her closer to understanding the significance of what they had stumbled upon. Michael, too, wrestled with the enormity of it. The mind sought patterns, explanations, reasons, but there were none that could fully reconcile the violence and secrecy with the ordinary life that the house had once seemed to offer. By evening, as the shadows grew long and the air cooled, the Thompsons remained outside, wrapped in blankets and holding Liam close. The house behind them seemed heavier, burdened with the revelation that it had held a life, silenced and hidden, for more than a decade. Michael and Emma understood that the day had altered their perception of home, of safety, of the ordinary rhythms of life. They were participants in a story that had begun long before their arrival, one that had been written in silence and preserved by neglect, now coming to light through chance and determination. As darkness fell fully, Michael found himself staring at the front of the house. The windows reflecting the last light of the sun, and the intrusion of the police lights. Emma beside him remained silent, their son asleep in the car, yet all three were acutely aware of the weight of what had been revealed. The fireplace, once a symbol of domestic warmth and comfort, had become a marker of tragedy and human cruelty. Michael thought of the life that had been ended, of the secrets that had been concealed, and of the ripple effect that their accidental discovery would set into motion. It was a night that promised no easy sleep, no return to normalcy. Each creak of the old floorboards, each distant sound outside the house, became a reminder of what had been unearthed. Michael and Emma knew that the discovery would follow them, haunt their thoughts, and demand action. The story behind the fireplace was larger than themselves, and yet they were now inextricably tied to it. They had uncovered not just a secret, but a truth that demanded recognition, investigation, and eventually justice. Sitting in the cold Charleston evening, the Thompsons felt the gravity of their discovery. Elmwood Street looked unchanged, indifferent to the events of the day, but 512 Elmwood Street had transformed irrevocably. The hidden life had been revealed, and the process of uncovering the story behind it had begun. For Michael and Emma, the knowledge carried a mixture of fear, sorrow, and a reluctant understanding that they could never return to the naive sense of safety and normalcy that had existed before the hammer struck the first brick. They had opened a door to the past, and the past was not finished with them yet. The next morning, the house on Elmwood Street was eerily quiet. The Thompson family had stayed with a close friend overnight, unable to face returning to the home where the unimaginable had been revealed. Michael and Emma sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee they barely tasted, their minds running through every detail of the previous day. Liam played quietly on the floor, his small toys scattered around him, and Michael found himself envying his child's innocence. Outside, the morning sun glinted off the roofs of neighboring homes, but the light offered no warmth or comfort. The events that had unfolded within their walls had transformed the familiar into something heavy and ominous, and the weight of it pressed upon them relentlessly. By mid-morning the call came. The coroner had completed a preliminary analysis, and law enforcement wanted to confirm the identity of the remains found in the fireplace. The name they revealed to Michael and Emma would pull the quiet, ordered world they had built apart at the seams. The victim was a man named Nathaniel Brooks, a carpenter who had been reported missing over a decade ago. Emma's hand flew to her mouth as Michael processed the information. Nathaniel Brooks had vanished in 2000, and the idea that he had been hidden inside the fireplace for all those years felt surreal, almost impossible. Their casual renovation project had collided with a mystery that spanned years, leaving them standing at the intersection of ordinary life and dark history. The detectives handling the case were methodical and professional, but there was an undeniable gravity in their presence. They explained that Nathaniel's disappearance had been reported to local authorities at the time, but leads had gone cold, and the trail had long since run out. Now, after more than a decade, the discovery in the Thompson fireplace had reopened questions that no one had dared to answer for years. Michael and Emma listened closely, realizing that their accidental discovery had triggered a chain reaction that would reach far beyond their neighborhood, far beyond themselves. The police arranged for a meeting with Nathaniel's mother, Margaret Brooks. She was a small woman with gray hair and wary eyes, having carried uncertainty and hope for more than 10 years. When detectives approached her with the news, her initial disbelief was profound. She had spent countless nights imagining the worst case scenarios. But now she had to confront the tangible reality. Her son's life had been violently ended and hidden. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the phone and listened to the officer's careful explanation, the weight of 10 years pressing down with every word. The grief that had been simmering beneath the surface exploded into a mixture of sorrow, relief, and anger. Michael and Emma, though not related to Nathaniel, felt an immediate connection to Margaret's anguish. They had been the unwitting discoverers, the accidental witnesses to a decade-old secret. And the responsibility of what they had found weighed heavily. They followed the officer's advice to stay removed, to allow law enforcement to manage the interactions with the family. But the reality of their involvement lingered, a constant presence that refused to fade. Emma's thoughts returned again and again to Nathaniel, imagining the moments he had once lived, the hopes he must have carried, and the life that had been stolen from him. Detectives worked to piece together the chain of events that had led to Nathaniel's disappearance and subsequent concealment. They explained that the evidence pointed to deliberate action, that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that Nathaniel remained hidden. Michael shivered at the thought, the meticulous planning required, and the cold intent that must have been behind it. He imagined the fear Nathaniel must have felt, the helplessness, the confusion, and it left him unable to focus on anything else. Emma, meanwhile, tried to compartmentalize her emotions, to maintain calm for Liam, but each conversation, each description, deepened the gravity of their involvement. When Margaret Brooks arrived at the police station, the reunion was muted, a delicate mixture of relief and devastation. Seeing the photograph of her son, recognizing the body that had been hidden for so long, was almost too much to bear. She cried quietly, clutching a small memento of Nathaniel, a baseball cap he had once worn, faded and frayed from years of use. Michael and Emma observed from a distance, their presence a reminder that ordinary people could unexpectedly find themselves entwined with extraordinary tragedy. Margaret's grief was deep and layered, a decade of unanswered questions now crystallized into unbearable clarity. The detectives guided Margaret through what they knew so far. Nathaniel had been hired for renovation work, had discovered something unsettling, and had been silenced by the person responsible. Details were sparing, carefully chosen, so as not to overwhelm her entirely, but the outline was unmistakable. Michael and Emma, sitting quietly in a separate area, could feel the intensity of the moment. The sense of closure mingled with the undeniable horror. Nathaniel's life had ended violently, and yet the discovery meant that truth long buried was finally surfacing. Throughout the day, Michael found himself reflecting on the intersection of fate and chance. Their decision to tackle the fireplace themselves, a simple act of home improvement, had collided with a narrative they could never have imagined. The unassuming Victorian house on Elmwood Street, with its polished floors and ornate crown molding, had harbored secrets that demanded attention. In uncovering Nathaniel's remains, they had inadvertently become participants in a story of human cruelty, loss, and delayed justice. The realization was almost suffocating, but there was also a strange, uncomfortable sense of purpose. They had brought the truth into the light. By evening, Margaret had begun to process the reality of what had happened to her son. Her grief was raw, but within it lay a thread of relief. After 10 years, she finally had answers. The Thompsons remained nearby, feeling both gratitude and sorrow that their actions had precipitated this reunion with reality. The neighborhood outside remained oblivious, the ordinary world continuing its rhythms, but inside the Thompson home, the weight of history had shifted. The fireplace, once a symbol of domestic warmth, had become a conduit for truth, forcing acknowledgement of a life lost and the long, hidden actions of those responsible. Michael and Emma left the station late that night, exhausted, haunted, and reflective. The city lights of Charleston blurred past as they drove home, but the image of Nathaniel's photograph, the knowledge of his life and death, lingered in their minds. Liam slept quietly in the back seat, unaware of the magnitude of the events that had unfolded around him. Yet their presence and protective silence were proof that life continued, even in the shadow of discovery. Michael held Emma's hand, both of them silently acknowledging that the world they had known had been irrevocably altered. Returning to the temporary sanctuary of their friend's home, the Thompsons finally allowed themselves a moment of stillness. The discovery had created a bridge between past and present, between a life lost and the truth finally revealed. Though Nathaniel's absence could never be undone, the knowledge of what had happened offered a sliver of closure, a small but undeniable victory for justice and recognition. Michael and Emma understood that this was only the beginning. The investigation would continue. The story of Nathaniel's life and death would unfold in greater detail, and the consequences for those responsible would eventually follow. As night deepened over Charleston, Michael and Emma sat quietly together, Liam asleep between them. The weight of the day pressing down, yet tempered by the knowledge that truth had been unearthed. The fireplace at 512 Elmwood Street would never again be just a fixture in their homes. It had become a symbol of revelation, of human resilience, and of the ways in which ordinary decisions could intersect with extraordinary histories. For the Thompsons, the discovery of Nathaniel Brooks was a reminder that beneath the surface of everyday life, hidden stories waited to be discovered, demanding attention, empathy, and the pursuit of justice. Detective Alina Ramirez arrived at the Thompson residence with the kind of measured calm that came from years of navigating scenes that most people could barely imagine. She was tall, with a sharp gaze and an air of quiet authority, and the moment she stepped onto Elmwood Street, the gravity of the day settled over her like a tangible weight. She had heard the preliminary reports over the phone, the discovery in the fireplace, the identification of Nathaniel Brooks, the long, unsolved disappearance, and already she felt the pull of the story waiting to be unraveled. For her, every brick removed, every layer of dust examined, was a clue, a key to understanding not just what had happened, but why it had been hidden for so long. Inside the house, the living room was still a tableau of controlled chaos. Photographers, officers, and forensic technicians moved with deliberate care, documenting every detail. Michael and Emma watched from a distance, their expressions etched with exhaustion and anxiety. Yet there was also a strange sense of purpose. They had uncovered something terrible, but in doing so, they had become vital witnesses in a story that demanded attention and justice. Detective Ramirez approached them carefully, her presence both professional and empathetic. She explained that the next steps would involve tracing Nathaniel's last known movements, identifying potential suspects, and reviewing historical records related to the house. Each detail mattered, no matter how small, because the person responsible had been meticulous in covering their tracks. The detective began with the property records and ownership history of 512 Elmwood Street. The house had changed hands several times, but the focus quickly narrowed to the owner at the time of Nathaniel's disappearance, a man named Victor Petrov, who had relocated to Charlotte, North Carolina shortly after the events. Ramirez noted the timeline carefully, the way ownership shifted, the quick sale following Nathaniel's disappearance, and the almost seamless erasure of records that might have linked Petrov to any wrongdoing. Each document, each date, added weight to the theory that this was not an accident or a random act, but a calculated attempt to hide a crime. Interviews followed. Neighbors remembered seeing Victor Petrov around the time Nathaniel was last reported, but his interactions had seemed ordinary, mundane. No one suspected the darkness lurking beneath the surface of his composed exterior. Detective Ramirez listened carefully, recording every detail, noting inconsistencies, and piecing together patterns. The small town had been oblivious to the sinister currents flowing beneath its calm streets. Yet the discovery in the Thompson fireplace was now the key that unlocked questions that had gone unanswered for years. The investigation quickly revealed another connection. Anton Volkov, Petrov's former business partner, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances a year before Nathaniel went missing. Ramirez's pulse quickened as she recognized the pattern. 2 disappearances linked by time, by location, and by the same man. It became clear that Nathaniel's fate was not an isolated incident. The deliberate concealment, the swift sale of property, and the absence of witnesses all pointed to a methodical approach to crime that demanded thorough investigation. Ramirez knew that she was dealing with a person who calculated every move with precision, and who expected the world to overlook the trail of destruction left behind. With the assistance of North Carolina law enforcement, Detective Ramirez traced Victor Petrov to a modest office in Charlotte. The man was older now, graying and composed, yet there was an unmistakable tension in the air as officers prepared to confront him. Petrov's calm demeanor gave nothing away, but Ramirez knew better. She had seen this kind of facade before: the quiet, professional exterior, concealing an intricate web of deception and violence. Documents, property records, and witness statements all pointed to him as the central figure responsible for both disappearances, and Ramirez was determined to bring the truth to light. Petrov was brought in for questioning, and Ramirez watched him carefully. His answers were measured, practiced, defensive. He admitted to hiring Nathaniel for renovation work, but denied any involvement in his disappearance. Yet when confronted with photographs and documents from the Elmwood fireplace, his composure wavered ever so slightly. Ramirez noted it, the flicker of recognition, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. This was someone who had expected his past to remain buried, and now it was resurfacing with a relentless force. The breakthrough came when Petrov's former wife, Irina, agreed to speak. She was reluctant, fearful of retaliation, but the weight of truth had become unbearable. She recounted details about arguments, altercations, and the concealment of Anton Volkov in the basement, painting a portrait of a man capable of extreme measures to protect himself and erase evidence. Ramirez listened, carefully documenting every word, aware that Irina's testimony could provide the critical link between the bodies, the house, and Petrov's calculated actions. The detective felt the narrative crystallize: the pattern of disappearances, the concealment of victims, and the long-delayed justice waiting to be served. The team then returned to 501 Elmwood Street, this time to investigate the basement thoroughly. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies beneath the concrete, and careful excavation uncovered human remains consistent with Anton Volkov. The forensic team confirmed the identity, so solidifying the connection between the 2 victims and the property's owner at the time. Ramirez felt a mixture of satisfaction and solemnity. The truth had been unearthed, but it came at the cost of human lives, a decade of mystery, and unimaginable suffering. Throughout the investigation, Michael and Emma remained in contact, providing details about their discovery and serving as witnesses to the sequence of events. Their role had shifted from homeowners to inadvertent participants in a historical crime investigation, their accidental action of renovating a fireplace becoming the linchpin that reopened a decade-old case. Each day brought more information, more confirmations, and a growing clarity about the depth of Petrov's actions and the careful orchestration that had allowed him to evade detection for so long. As the investigation progressed, Detective Ramirez began coordinating with prosecutors to prepare a case strong enough to hold up in court. Every document, every testimony, every forensic report was critical. The meticulous care with which Petrov had hidden the crimes meant that any misstep could allow him to escape accountability. Ramirez's attention to detail became both shield and weapon, ensuring that the sequence of events could be traced, the evidence preserved, and the truth presented convincingly. Late at night, Ramirez would sit in her office, reviewing photographs, timelines, and witness statements. She thought about Nathaniel, about Anton, and about the families whose lives had been disrupted, torn apart, and denied closure. Each page, each image, reminded her that behind every case was human suffering, and that justice was not merely a procedural outcome, but a moral imperative. The knowledge that the Thompson family had stumbled upon the truth added a layer of poignancy to the work. Ordinary people had illuminated a secret that would have remained hidden otherwise. By the time the pieces began to coalesce, Ramirez knew that they had sufficient evidence to move forward with charges against Viktor Petrov. The combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and historical documentation left little room for doubt. Yet she also recognized the weight of what had been uncovered, the lives lost, the deception maintained for over a decade, and the long road toward closure for the families involved. Elmwood Street, once a quiet suburban stretch in Charleston, had become a testament to the persistence of truth and the consequences of hidden violence. The morning Viktor Petrov was taken into custody, the air in Charlotte felt heavier than usual. Detective Alina Ramirez watched as officers led him out of the office building, his posture calm and controlled, betraying nothing. Petrov's gray hair caught the sunlight, his expression unreadable, a mask perfected over years of deception. The officers guided him into the squad car, the sound of the doors slamming echoing against the empty street. Ramirez followed behind, the weight of years of investigation pressing on her shoulders, but also the sense of resolution that comes from finally cornering a man who had believed he could evade justice forever. At the station, Petrov was escorted to an interrogation room that had been prepped for hours. The room was stark, cold, lit by a single overhead fluorescent light that cast harsh shadows across the table. Ramirez sat across from him, file folders neatly stacked to her right, each containing evidence, photographs, and witness statements. Petrov's hands were folded calmly in front of him, his gray eyes meeting hers without a flicker of emotion. "Viktor Petrov," she began, her voice measured, professional. "You've been brought in today in connection with the deaths of Nathaniel Brooks and Anton Volkov. I need to ask you some questions." Petrov's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've already told everything I know," he said evenly, his accent noticeable but controlled. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ramirez didn't flinch. Years of experience had taught her that composure, like this, often hid a storm beneath. She slid a photograph across the table, Nathaniel's face, smiling, unaware of the tragedy that would befall him. Petrov's eyes flicked to it, the slightest tightening at the corner of his jaw, betraying a flicker of recognition. Ramirez noted it, the small movement that revealed more than words ever could. For hours, Ramirez and her team pieced through the interrogation meticulously. Every answer Petrov gave was weighed, cross-referenced with witness statements and forensic evidence. He claimed ignorance, feigned confusion, and shifted blame subtly, but the inconsistencies were telling. Ramirez observed the patterns, the pauses, the micro-expressions, the slight hesitations, and she knew she was dealing with a man who had calculated every move, who had built a life around carefully crafted lies. It was exhausting work, both mentally and emotionally. But Ramirez understood that patience and observation would ultimately break through even the most carefully constructed facade. The detectives also brought in Irina Petrov, Viktor's former wife, hoping to gain insight into the man they were interrogating. She entered the room quietly, her presence tentative, and Ramirez noticed immediately the tension that radiated from her. She had lived with the knowledge of Victor's actions for years, trapped in fear and uncertainty, and now, for the first time, she had the opportunity to speak without immediate threat. Ramirez approached gently, acknowledging the courage it took for her to come forward. Irina's testimony began cautiously, but with each detail she revealed arguments, altercations, the concealment of Anton in the basement. The forced silence of Nathaniel the puzzle began to take shape. Victor remained seated across from Ramirez, listening, his expression carefully neutral. But the weight of Irina's words was unmistakable. The room felt smaller, the fluorescent light harsher, as the reality of exposure pressed against him. Ramirez could sense the tension building in the air, a quiet storm of anticipation and dread, the moment when the truth, long buried, began to crack through the layers of deception. Every word from Irina was a brushstroke painting the full picture of calculated violence and concealment. Each revelation another thread in the narrative Ramirez had been weaving for years. Outside the interrogation room, officers and forensic teams worked to finalize their reports, preparing the case for the prosecutor. Every photograph, document, and note was cataloged meticulously. Ramirez moved between the rooms, ensuring continuity and completeness, aware that any oversight could give Victor room to manipulate the truth. The city felt indifferent, the streets of Charlotte continuing their rhythm, but inside the station, time was suspended. Each tick of the clock marking the unraveling of a carefully maintained faade. As the interrogation continued, Petrov's composure began to falter. A flicker in his eyes, a pause in his speech, a subtle tightening of the jaw. Ramirez noted everything. Years of evasion had built a shield, but the weight of evidence, combined with witness testimony, was eroding it. She remained calm, professional, her questions precise, targeted, designed to expose contradictions without giving him room to maneuver. Ramirez understood that patience was as powerful as confrontation. A single misstep by Petrov could provide the clarity they needed. Late in the evening, the interrogation concluded temporarily to allow all parties to review the evidence. Petrov was led back to a holding cell, still silent, still controlled, but Ramirez could feel the tension lingering in the air. The hours of questioning had peeled back layers of denial and pretense, and though the full confession had not been extracted, the foundations for a compelling case had been established. She reviewed her notes meticulously, aware that the prosecutor would rely heavily on the observations, recordings, and testimonies compiled during these sessions. Ramirez also reflected on the families affected by these crimes. Nathaniel's mother, Margaret, had been briefed, her grief and relief mingled in a fragile balance. The knowledge that the man responsible for her son's death had been apprehended offered a measure of solace, though it could never undo the loss. Similarly, the discovery of Anton's remains brought closure to questions that had lingered for over a decade. Ramirez understood the emotional weight that came with her job. Solving the case was not just a procedural task, but a restoration of dignity to lives long impacted by deceit and violence. The station was quiet in the late hours, punctuated only by the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of officers preparing reports. Ramirez sat with a mug of lukewarm coffee, reviewing timelines, witness statements, and photographs. She knew the trial ahead would be long and complex, that Victor Petrov's defense would be formidable, and that every detail needed to be airtight. Yet amidst the fatigue, there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the arc of justice beginning to bend. In witnessing the first tangible steps toward accountability, that night, Ramirez allowed herself a moment to reflect on the journey. From the Thompsons' accidental discovery to the painstaking investigation, the arrest, and the initial interrogation, the case had unfolded like a dark thread weaving through time and space. The careful uncovering of evidence, the patient collection of testimony, and the relentless pursuit of truth had brought them to a point where justice could finally begin. Victor Petrov may have once believed he could evade consequences, but the convergence of discovery, investigation, and unwavering attention to detail had brought him face to face with accountability. As the first hours of dawn crept over Charlotte, the station remained alive with activity, officers preparing reports, Ramirez coordinating evidence, and Petrov waiting in a holding cell that offered neither comfort nor escape. The story of hidden lives, long-concealed crimes, and the eventual unveiling of truth was far from over. The trial would be the next chapter, where every revelation would be scrutinized, every witness examined, and every piece of evidence contested. Ramirez understood that the tension, the anticipation, and the moral weight of the case would carry forward into the courtroom. And yet, there was an undeniable sense of progress. After more than a decade of unanswered questions, deception, and silence, Viktor Petrov had been located, apprehended, and confronted. The lives of Nathaniel Brooks and Anton Volkov, long obscured by secrecy, had finally been acknowledged. The Thompsons, accidental witnesses to this unfolding truth, had played a crucial role in bringing the story to light. Detective Ramirez, seasoned and relentless, had guided the investigation to a pivotal point, ensuring that justice would no longer be delayed. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long lines across the interrogation room, a quiet reminder that the pursuit of truth, no matter how long it takes, is never in vain. The courthouse in Charleston was bustling with an energy that was both charged and somber. On the morning of the trial, the public gallery was already filling with people who had followed the case from its startling discovery to the apprehension of Viktor Petrov. Journalists adjusted cameras and notepads, neighbors whispered, and family members of Nathaniel Brooks and Anton Volkov took seats, their faces etched with years of waiting grief and hope for justice. Detective Elena Ramirez arrived early, carrying bundles filled with evidence, photographs, and witness statements. She knew that the courtroom would be a stage where every detail, every nuance of testimony, and every shred of evidence would be scrutinized. Viktor Petrov entered the courtroom with the same composed exterior he had maintained since his arrest. Gray hair neatly combed, posture erect, his expression betrayed nothing. Ramirez noted how calculated his movements were, the subtle way he scanned the room, noting jurors and reporters alike. The prosecution team, led by a seasoned attorney named Sarah Caldwell, prepared meticulously, reviewing notes and cross-referencing evidence to ensure the case would be airtight. Across the aisle, Petrov's defense attorney moved with quiet confidence. A man whose reputation for crafting narratives from gaps and ambiguities was well known. From the moment opening statements began, tension filled the air. Caldwell spoke with measured intensity, recounting the discovery of Nathaniel Brooks's remains by the Thompsons and the careful investigation that traced the crime to Petrov. The words painted a vivid image of the crime and a life hidden, concealed, and silenced for over a decade. A pattern of calculated actions that spoke to deliberate intent. The jurors listened intently, their eyes following every gesture, every inflection, as the narrative unfolded. Petrov remained motionless, eyes fixed on a point in the distance, the faintest tightening of his jaw betraying the slightest reaction to the unfolding story. The prosecution called the first witnesses, starting with Detective Ramirez. She recounted the sequence of events from the discovery at Elmwood Street to the identification of Nathaniel Brooks, and then the unraveling of connections to Anton Volkov. Her voice was calm, factual, yet carried the weight of years of investigation. The jury absorbed every detail, every date, every carefully documented observation. Ramirez emphasized the meticulous nature of the investigation, the consistency of evidence, and the corroboration provided by multiple sources. Each fact presented chipped away at the veil of denial that Petrov had relied upon for so long. Next, the Thompsons were called to testify. Michael and Emma described their decision to renovate the fireplace, the moment of discovery, and the shock and horror they experienced. Their words were simple, matter-of-fact, yet the emotion beneath the surface was undeniable. They spoke of Liam, their young son, and the difficulty of protecting him while navigating the reality of what they had uncovered. Their testimony humanized the event, transforming it from a distant crime into a visceral reality that the jurors could feel, a tangible impact of Petrov's actions. Margaret Brooks, Nathaniel's mother, took the stand with trembling hands and a quiet dignity. She recounted the decade of uncertainty, the nights spent wondering what had become of her son, and the moment she learned the truth. Her voice broke as she spoke of hope and grief intermingled, of the relief in knowing what had happened, and of the lingering pain of having been denied the chance to say goodbye. Each word resonated through the courtroom, a reminder that the human cost of Petrov's crimes extended far beyond the physical concealment of bodies. The defense attempted to undermine credibility, highlighting the passage of time, potential memory lapses, and inconsistencies in witness statements. Petrov's attorney argued that evidence could be misinterpreted, and that the discovery of Nathaniel's remains, while tragic, did not conclusively prove Petrov's direct involvement. Ramirez and Caldwell anticipated these tactics and had prepared to reinforce every point with corroborating documentation, property records, timelines, photographs, forensic analysis, and Irina Petrov's detailed testimony. The defense's efforts were methodical, but the weight of accumulated evidence was increasingly difficult to counter. Irina Petrov's testimony was particularly powerful. She recounted the events leading to Anton Volkov's death, the concealment in the basement, and the subsequent disappearance of Nathaniel Brooks. Her voice, at first hesitant and fearful, grew firmer as she detailed the circumstances she had witnessed. The jury could see the toll these years had taken on her, and the courage it required to reveal the truth. She described the manipulation and control exerted by Victor, her fear for her own safety, and the burden of living with a secret that had destroyed lives. Each word added depth to the narrative, bridging the gap between evidence and human experience. Forensic experts followed, providing detailed accounts of the physical evidence. Bones, traces of soil, and structural analysis of the fireplace and basement all supported the timeline and circumstances presented by the witnesses. The medical examiner explained the cause of death, the nature of injuries, and the evidence of concealment. Each expert delivered testimony with precision, reinforcing the prosecution's case, and providing the jurors with clear, indisputable facts that linked Petrov to the deaths. The weight of scientific and procedural evidence complemented the emotional testimony, creating a multi-layered narrative of responsibility and accountability. Throughout the proceedings, Petrov remained largely impassive, though subtle expressions betrayed a careful calculation of how to respond. He did not testify, following his attorney's advice, but his presence in the courtroom was a constant reminder of the tension between the law and deception. Caldwell used every opportunity to contrast his composed exterior with the gravity of his actions, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the concealment and the long-term impact on the victims' families. Each statement, each photograph, each documented fact pushed the narrative forward, highlighting the thoroughness of the investigation and the inevitability of justice. Closing arguments drew the trial to a tense crescendo. Caldwell spoke with controlled intensity, reminding the jury of the discovery at Elmwood Street, the meticulous investigation, the corroborating testimony of multiple witnesses, and the undeniable link to Petrov. She emphasized the human cost, the loss of life, and the deliberate concealment that had extended the family's suffering. The defense countered with appeals to doubt, character witnesses, and arguments about interpretation and memory. But the accumulated weight of evidence was increasingly overwhelming. The jury faced the task of navigating complex emotional and factual terrain, balancing empathy, logic, and the imperative for justice. As the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom emptied slowly. The families lingered, absorbing the gravity of the proceedings, aware that the next hours or days would determine the outcome for Viktor Petrov and the measure of justice for Nathaniel Brooks and Anton Volkov. Detective Ramirez reviewed notes, cross-checked testimony, and ensured that all evidence was accounted for. Aware that the integrity of the investigation would be critical in guiding the jury to a fair verdict, The tension remained, a charged stillness that marked the space between revelation and resolution. Outside, Elmwood Street was quiet once again. The ordinary rhythms of life continued, indifferent to the extraordinary events that had unfolded in the courthouse. Yet inside, the weight of years, the cumulative effort of investigation, and the bravery of witnesses had brought the case to a pivotal moment. The trial was not just a legal proceeding. It was the culmination of long, hidden truths, the intersection of human courage and meticulous justice, and the final act in a story that had begun in a quiet home and reverberated through time, demanding acknowledgement and closure. The courtroom was tense with an almost tangible weight, as the jury retired to deliberate. The air seemed heavier than usual, thick with anticipation, and every person present felt the gravity of what hung in the balance. For over a decade, the lives of Nathaniel Brooks and Anton Volkov had been shrouded in mystery, their fates hidden in silence. And now the responsibility of determining justice rested in the hands of strangers tasked with weighing years of evidence, testimony, and emotion. Outside, sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, glinting off polished wood and brass fixtures. But inside, the world had narrowed to the quiet murmurs of jurors behind closed doors, and the silent focus of those waiting for the outcome. Families sat in the gallery, holding themselves taut with anticipation. Margaret Brooks' hands were clasped tightly together, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the front of the courtroom, though her thoughts were elsewhere. Racing through memories of her son, the questions she had carried for years, the hope she had nurtured, and the fear she had endured. Anton Volkov's sister sat beside her, her expression somber, her lips pressed into a thin line. Friends and neighbors, journalists, and even the Thompsons who had first uncovered the secret in the fireplace were present, each carrying a sense of invested attention, each aware that the next hours could finally provide a measure of closure. Inside the jury room, the 12 jurors settled into the chairs around the long oak table. The foreperson called the room to order, the weight of responsibility pressing on everyone present. They began reviewing evidence, photographs, and witness statements again, the details replaying in their minds like a series of interconnected events that were impossible to ignore. There was debate, at times heated, as perspectives clashed. Some jurors focused on the meticulous nature of the investigation, others on the human testimony of grief and courage. Each voice, each observation, helped shape the collective understanding of the case, and every juror wrestled with the burden of making a decision that would forever alter lives. Michael and Emma sat in the gallery, their hands intertwined. The memory of that first swing of the sledgehammer, the dust, the smell, the moment when the discovery became horrifyingly real, they relived it in quiet reverie. Liam, now sitting on Emma's lap, fidgeted with the edge of a notebook, sensing the tension but unaware of its full meaning. Michael's mind wandered to Nathaniel and Anton, to the families whose lives had been upended, and to the man who had thought he could escape accountability. He felt a mix of relief that the truth had surfaced and apprehension about the verdict. Knowing that justice required more than discovery, it demanded recognition, responsibility, and moral courage. Hours passed slowly. The jury returned multiple times to review specific photographs, property records, and transcripts from witness testimony. Discussions were long and meticulous, each juror questioning and challenging the interpretations of others. The deliberate pace underscored the gravity of the responsibility. These were not hypothetical scenarios or fictional narratives, but real lives, real tragedies, and a man's freedom hanging in the balance. Outside, the courthouse remained silent, ordinary pedestrians passing by unaware of the high-stakes drama unfolding within its walls. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere grew taut as the judge received notice that the jury had reached a decision. Everyone rose as the 12 jurors filed back into the room, each carrying the weight of deliberation in their posture and expressions. Margaret Brooks held her hands together tightly, her knuckles pressing into her palms, while Anton Volkov's sister adjusted her seating nervously. The gallery seemed to hold its collective breath, aware that the next moments would transform years of uncertainty into something permanent. A verdict that would finally acknowledge the truth that had been hidden for so long. The foreperson stood and handed the verdict sheet to the court clerk. The room was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes breathing feel heavier. The judge began to read aloud, each word deliberate, each pause a drumbeat of anticipation. For Alex Volkov Anton's real name restored in official records, the jury found Viktorov guilty of first-degree murder. The words hung in the air, a revelation that sent a ripple through the courtroom. Margaret's face, already lined with grief, softened slightly at the acknowledgement, though the depth of loss remained. The second count, Nathaniel Brooks, guilty as charged. The verdict was clear, undeniable, and the tension in the room broke in a collective exhale, tears, and quiet sobs. Margaret's body shook as she turned to face the courtroom, her emotions a mix of relief, grief, and an overwhelming sense of justice finally served. She could hardly speak, but her eyes met the casket of images and memories she had carried for over 10 years. Michael and Emma sat in silence beside Liam, their own experience intertwined with the family's pain. Knowing that their accidental discovery had set the stage for this long-awaited reckoning. Anton's sister and other family members embraced quietly, tears rolling down cheeks that had been hardened by years of unanswered questions. The courtroom itself seemed to breathe, the weight of years of concealment and fear lifting, replaced by the clarity of justice recognized. Viktor Petrov remained impassive, a mask of calm that could not hide the consequences now imposed. He had calculated, manipulated, and hidden for over a decade, but the jury's decision had pierced the carefully constructed facade. The gravity of the judgment, the evidence meticulously compiled over years, and the courage of witnesses like Irina Petrov had combined to hold him accountable in a court of law. The silence of the courtroom after the announcement was heavy, a testament to both the severity of the crimes and the relief that the families finally could begin to heal. The sentencing hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later, but in that moment, the immediate sense of justice resonated deeply. Margaret, despite the tears, felt a measure of peace. The 10 years of waiting, the questions that had haunted every day, the uncertainty that had never fully lifted, were now confronted with truth and acknowledgement. Michael and Emma, too, experienced a mixture of satisfaction and somber reflection. They had merely renovated a fireplace, but in doing so, they had unlocked a story long hidden, connected to lives, grief, and justice in ways they could never have anticipated. As the families left the courtroom, each step was heavy with emotion. Margaret and Anton's sister walked together, speaking softly, sharing memories, acknowledging the reality that, while justice had been served, the absence of their loved ones would never be erased. Outside, sunlight glinted off the courthouse steps, and the air seemed lighter, though the scars of loss remained. Michael and Emma lingered briefly, absorbing the finality of the verdict, knowing that their lives had intersected with a long, hidden story, and that their discovery had made a difference. For the Thompsons, the house on Elmwood Street remained a symbol of both horror and resolution. It had revealed a secret that could not have been anticipated, a dark history now confronted with accountability. The jury's verdict did not erase the pain, but it provided a form of acknowledgement that had been absent for over a decade. In the faces of the families, in the courtroom, and in the quiet streets outside, there was a recognition that truth, once uncovered, carries with it both weight and relief, sorrow and resolution. And as the day ended, Detective Ramirez reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this point, the accidental discovery by ordinary homeowners, the painstaking investigation, the witness testimonies, the careful preservation of evidence, and the moral courage it had taken for people to speak and act. Justice, she thought, was not merely the verdict in a courtroom. It was the culmination of persistence, patience, and the willingness to confront even the darkest corners of human behavior. Elmwood Street might return to quiet, ordinary life, but the impact of what had been revealed, and the acknowledgement of long, hidden truth, would linger in the hearts of those who had borne witness to it, forever marking the place where justice had finally found its way. After the verdict, life in Charleston seemed to shift, though it did so unevenly, like a tide that lifts some boats while leaving others grounded. The Brooks family felt a quiet, heavy relief, as though the 10 years of uncertainty that had weighed on them were suddenly acknowledged, given form and substance in the courtroom. Margaret Brooks still carried grief in every movement, every glance, every pause in conversation, but there was a steadiness now, a sense that the nightmare of unanswered questions had finally reached its conclusion. She spent hours sitting quietly in her home, photographs of Nathaniel spread across the living room, each image a reminder of the life that had been stolen and the justice that had finally been served. The funeral for Nathaniel was small but deeply emotional, held at the Riverside Church, a place where he had spent countless Sundays as a child. The pews were filled with family, friends, and members of the community who had followed the story, their faces lined with empathy, grief, and respect. Margaret stood at the front, her voice trembling but clear, recounting the life her son, his love for carpentry, his devotion to family, his dreams of starting his own business. She spoke of his laughter, his kindness, the ordinary moments that had been his alone until they were taken. Tears rolled freely, yet she did not falter, each word a testament to her determination to honor Nathaniel's life. Anton Volkov's family also gathered, traveling from out of state to pay their respects. His sister, Alina, spoke at the service with a quiet strength that belied the grief etched into her features. She shared memories of Anton's humor, his dedication to his work, the little things that made him beloved by those who knew him. The weight of years lost was palpable in the room, yet within it was also a collective sense of closure. The acknowledgement that the truth had emerged, and that the lives of both men had been honored. The community, once unaware of the darkness hidden behind the walls of Elmwood Street, now came together to witness, grieve, and support the families who had suffered in silence for too long. The Thompsons, who had unwittingly set the events in motion, also felt the aftermath deeply. They had discovered Nathaniel in their fireplace, a moment that had shattered their sense of normalcy and thrust them into a story far larger than their own. Michael often found himself thinking about the first swing of the sledgehammer, the dust, and the dark hollow that had changed everything. Emma carried the weight of protecting Liam while navigating the shock and horror, a constant reminder that their accidental involvement had consequences for all the lives connected to the house. Despite the fear and unease, they felt a sense of purpose, knowing that their curiosity and initiative had brought long-hidden truths into the light. In the weeks following the funeral, the neighborhood around Elmwood Street began to process what had happened. Ordinary life resumed outwardly, children played, neighbors waved, and the rhythm of daily routines returned, but the memory of the discovery lingered like a shadow. The house itself was no longer a safe, familiar space. Its history of violence and concealment had transformed it into a site of memory and caution. The Thompsons ultimately decided to sell the property, unable to reconcile their presence with the haunting knowledge of what had been hidden in its walls. A developer eventually tore the house down, building a new structure, modern and void of any remnants of the past. But the story of Elmwood Street remained, a quiet reminder to the community of the fragility of safety and the unexpected intersections of ordinary life with extraordinary tragedy. Margaret Brooks began a ritual that offered both solace and connection. Every Sunday, she visited Riverside Cemetery, kneeling beside Nathaniel's grave, bringing fresh flowers, and speaking softly about the weeks and months she had lived without him. She shared stories of her own day, updates on the world he had missed, and reflections on the justice that had been served. Though she knew that no verdict or sentence could restore the years she had lost with her son, the act of witnessing, remembering, and speaking aloud allowed her a measure of control over the grief, a way to assert her love and memory against the silence of the past decade. Michael and Emma found themselves occasionally revisiting the story, recounting the events to close friends, reflecting on the strange and profound way their lives had intersected with Nathaniel's and Anton's. They marveled at the fragility of normalcy, the hidden threads of human behavior, and the way chance, curiosity, and courage could alter the course of justice. Liam, now aware that the fireplace had been more than it seemed, asked questions with the kind of curiosity only a child could muster, and the Thompsons answered carefully, framing the narrative in terms of truth, responsibility, and the importance of doing what is right even when it is difficult. The trial and verdict also rippled through the local legal and law enforcement communities. Detective Ramirez and her colleagues received quiet acknowledgement for their meticulous work, the patient piecing together of evidence that had allowed the truth to surface. The discovery by the Thompsons had been a catalyst, but it was the diligent work of investigators, prosecutors, and witnesses that had transformed that discovery into accountability. Ramirez often reflected on the case late at night, thinking of Nathaniel and Anton, their families, and the extraordinary courage it had taken for people to speak and act. In her quiet moments, she allowed herself a mixture of satisfaction and solemnity, knowing that justice had been served, though the loss remained irreversible. Over time, the Brooks and Volkov families began to find ways to honor the lives of their loved ones. Memorials were held, stories shared, and acts of remembrance became a part of their communities. The families leaned on each other, forming bonds of shared grief and resilience, a network of support that allowed them to navigate the long shadow cast by years of uncertainty. Though the grief never disappeared entirely, it was tempered by recognition, justice, and the simple act of telling the story, ensuring that Nathaniel and Anton were remembered not only for the tragedy of their deaths, but for the fullness of the lives they had lived. For the Thompsons, life gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the memory of Elmwood Street and the discovery would remain forever imprinted on their consciousness. The ordinary act of home renovation had led them to a story of human cruelty, resilience, and justice, and their lives were irrevocably connected to the broader arc of truth and accountability. Each decision, each swing of the hammer, had intersected with a history that demanded recognition, and they carried the knowledge that their curiosity had played a crucial role in bringing closure to families who had lived with uncertainty for far too long. Even years later, the lessons of Elmwood Street remained vivid. Margaret Brooks continued her visits to the cemetery, finding peace in ritual and remembrance. Michael and Emma reflected on the fragility of life, the hidden narratives in ordinary spaces, and the way courage and persistence, even in small acts, could transform the course of history. The community, while returning to its usual rhythms, carried the memory of what had happened, a cautionary tale of hidden truths and the resilience required to confront them. Elmwood Street had become a testament not only to the tragedies that had occurred, but to the endurance of human spirit, the pursuit of justice, and the irreplaceable value of bringing hidden truths into the light. Months had passed since the courtroom drama concluded, but for Michael and Emma Thompson, the echoes of Elmwood Street were still present in every creak of the house, every flicker of shadow across a wall, and in the way the air seemed heavier on quiet mornings. They had moved to a new home, one with no dark history and no hidden corners. But the memory of what they had uncovered, the human remains, hidden behind the bricks, the story of Nathaniel Brooks and Anton Volkov remained with them, indelible and constant. Life had resumed its rhythm, with work, school, and the ordinary demands of raising Liam, yet beneath the surface, the extraordinary weight of their accidental discovery lingered, shaping the way they moved through the world. Emma often found herself thinking about the fragility of life and the invisible narratives that existed around them, unnoticed until fate intervened. She would walk through the rooms of their new house, imagining the lives that had passed through these walls before them, wondering what secrets might remain hidden in ordinary spaces. Michael shared similar thoughts, replaying moments of the past year, the first swing of the sledgehammer, the horror and disbelief, the methodical unraveling of a decade-old crime, and realizing how one seemingly small decision had transformed their lives and the lives of the families they had inadvertently touched. They spoke quietly about it to each other, careful to balance the need to process the trauma with the need to continue living, to shield Liam from the shadow of events that he could not fully comprehend. Thompsons maintained contact with the Brooks and Volkov families, sharing a connection forged in extraordinary circumstances. Margaret Brooks, though still carrying her grief, had begun to find peace in small rituals and the support of those who had stood beside her through the trial and the funeral. Her visits to Nathaniel's grave became quieter and more contemplative, less raw with sorrow and more with remembrance. She would share updates with Michael and Emma when they visited, expressing gratitude not only for their role in uncovering the truth, but also for their steadfastness in bearing witness. These moments were punctuated with tears, laughter, and silence, creating a tapestry of shared experience that reminded them all of the resilience of the human spirit. The neighborhood around Elmwood Street, too, had shifted in its perception of normalcy. The story of the discovery, the investigation, and the trial had left an indelible mark. Residents spoke of the events with hushed reverence, a mixture of disbelief and cautious curiosity. The property had been demolished and replaced with a modern structure. Yet the story of the hidden lives and the eventual justice persisted in local memory. Elmwood Street became an unspoken symbol, a reminder that even the most ordinary places could hold extraordinary secrets, and that ordinary people, curious, attentive, and courageous, could play an essential role in uncovering them. Michael found himself occasionally walking through the neighborhood alone, reflecting on the series of coincidences and decisions that had brought them to this point. He thought about the domino effect, their choice to renovate the fireplace, the discovery, the meticulous investigation, and the trial. Each step had been intertwined with human lives, grief, courage, and justice, and each had shaped him in ways he could never have anticipated. The awareness of how fragile safety and routine could be, how quickly ordinary life could intersect with extraordinary tragedy, lingered in his consciousness, coloring his perception of the world and deepening his empathy for others. Emma, meanwhile, focused on helping Liam understand the importance of curiosity, honesty, and moral courage. Though she tailored these lessons to a child's understanding, they spoke of doing the right thing even when it is difficult, about standing up for truth and justice, and about the quiet ways in which ordinary people can make a difference. The story of Elmwood Street, carefully distilled into age-appropriate lessons, became a part of Liam's early understanding of the world, not as a tale of horror, but as a testament to the impact of integrity, courage, and resilience. The Thompsons also began contributing to the broader community's understanding of the events. They participated in talks at local schools, historical societies, and civic groups, sharing insights into the importance of vigilance, moral responsibility, and awareness of the hidden narratives that can exist even in the most familiar places. Their story, while rooted in tragedy, offered lessons about empathy, ethical action, and the profound consequences of everyday decisions. The Thompsons became, in a quiet way, stewards of memory, ensuring that the narrative of Elmwood Street remained a source of learning, not just fear. Margaret Brooks and Anton's sister, Alina, focused on creating legacies for their loved ones. Memorial scholarships were established in Nathaniel and Anton's names, supporting young people in carpentry and construction trades, honoring the passions and talents of the men whose lives had been cut short. Community events celebrated their creativity and dedication, turning the tragedy into something that could inspire and support future generations. The families found a sense of purpose in these actions, transforming grief into constructive energy and creating spaces where the memory of Nathaniel and Anton could have enduring impact. Detective Ramirez, too, reflected on the long-term significance of the case. Beyond the immediate resolution and the conviction of Viktor Petrov, she considered how the story had illuminated the importance of perseverance, meticulous attention to detail, and the moral imperative to pursue truth. Her work had not ended with the courtroom verdict. It continued in mentoring young detectives, participating in community outreach, and supporting the families who had endured so much. The case became a touchstone in her career, a reminder that justice is rarely instantaneous, but that persistence and courage, whether from professionals or ordinary people, can uncover even the most deeply hidden truths. Over time, Elmwood Street itself regained a sense of quiet order. Though the memory of what had occurred lingered in the minds of those who lived there, the rebuilt house, modern and unassuming, bore no trace of the dark history that had once been concealed within its walls. Yet the story was never forgotten. Neighbors spoke occasionally of the discovery, of the families, and of the investigation, ensuring that the events were preserved as part of the local memory. It became a story of resilience, moral courage, and the delicate interplay between chance, curiosity, and justice, a reminder that hidden narratives can exist anywhere, waiting for the truth to be revealed. For the Thompsons, life eventually returned to a rhythm that felt safe, though never entirely ordinary. Emma and Michael continued their work and parenting, yet they carried a deeper awareness of human fragility, moral responsibility, and the profound impact of seemingly small actions. They lived with the knowledge that a single choice, a swing of a hammer, a decision to look closely at something unusual, had altered lives forever. Elmwood Street had left an imprint on their consciousness, a reminder that ordinary people can play extraordinary roles in the unfolding of truth and justice. Years later, when Michael and Emma looked back on the events, they recognized the interconnectedness of everything: their own actions, the courage of witnesses, the dedication of law enforcement, and the resilience of the families involved. The discovery had set off a chain reaction that ultimately restored some measure of justice, created lasting legacies for Nathaniel and Anton, and reshaped the lives of everyone involved. It became a story not just of tragedy and crime, but of human courage, moral responsibility, and the enduring power of truth. In the weeks following the trials and verdicts, Charleston began to settle into a quieter rhythm. Though the events of Elmwood Street remained a vivid memory for those who had lived through it, the courthouse, once filled with the tension of testimonies and deliberations, had emptied, leaving only the echoes of voices that had sought justice and the lingering presence of truth finally acknowledged. For the Thompsons, Margaret Brooks, and Anton Volkov's family, the passing days were a delicate balancing act between moving forward and honoring the past, between daily life and the gravity of what had been uncovered. The city itself seemed to exhale, yet a collective awareness lingered that ordinary spaces could conceal extraordinary secrets, and that the pursuit of justice required vigilance, courage, and persistence. The Thompsons gradually returned to routines that had been interrupted by shock and investigation. Emma and Michael settled Liam into a school schedule, returned to work, and began filling their evenings with ordinary domestic rhythms. Yet the memory of the fireplace, the dark hollow, the dust, the sudden revelation of human life hidden within it never fully faded. It had become a permanent lens through which they viewed the world, a reminder that curiosity and moral responsibility could intersect with fate in ways that could forever alter lives. The decision to renovate had seemed mundane at first, but its consequences rippled outward, affecting families, law enforcement, and the wider community in ways no one could have anticipated. Margaret Brooks continued her quiet rituals of remembrance, visiting Nathaniel's grave with flowers and photographs, speaking softly about the son she had lost but whose life had finally been acknowledged. Each visit was a mixture of sorrow and solace, grief and relief. The act of remembrance allowed her to maintain a tangible connection to Nathaniel, honoring his memory while also accepting that justice had been served. Over time, she began speaking publicly at community gatherings, sharing her story to underscore the importance of awareness, the value of persistence in seeking truth, and the resilience required to survive prolonged uncertainty. Her words resonated with families who had faced loss, and with neighbors who had grown closer through shared empathy and understanding. Anton Volkov's family also found ways to commemorate his life. Alina Volkov, his sister, established a small scholarship in his name for students pursuing careers in skilled trades, especially carpentry and construction, honoring Anton's passion and skill. Community members contributed, local businesses donated, and soon a modest foundation emerged, celebrating creativity, hard work, and dedication. In creating a legacy from tragedy, the Volkov family found purpose, transforming grief into something that could benefit others and keep Anton's spirit alive in practical, meaningful ways. The scholarship became more than just a memorial. It was a symbol of continuity, of life extending beyond the confines of tragedy, and of human resilience. For the Thompsons, the neighborhood itself became a quiet reminder of the events that had shaped their lives. Elmwood Street, once a place of ordinary suburban life, had been irrevocably transformed by the discovery of Nathaniel's remains. The house was demolished and replaced with a modern structure, a blank slate, but the memory persisted in the minds of residents, neighbors, and the Thompsons themselves. Walking past the site, Michael would often reflect on how fragile safety and normalcy could be. How ordinary choices like swinging a hammer or inspecting a fireplace could intersect with hidden histories and unearthed truths that demanded attention. It was a lesson in vigilance, moral responsibility, and the unexpected power of human action. Detective Alina Ramirez, though no longer actively investigating the case, continued to reflect on its impact. She shared the story with colleagues, mentoring younger officers about the importance of careful documentation, patience, and ethical rigor. She understood that her role extended beyond the courtroom and beyond the immediate resolution of the case. By ensuring that evidence was meticulously collected and that witnesses were protected and supported, Ramirez had helped secure justice. And she now used that case as a teaching tool, emphasizing that even ordinary moments could have extraordinary consequences. The Elmwood Street case became a touchstone in her career, a reminder of why persistence, attention to detail, and compassion were inseparable in the pursuit of justice. Community members, too, were affected in subtle but meaningful ways. Conversations at local gatherings, neighborhood meetings, and casual encounters often included references to the events, framed as cautionary tales and lessons in vigilance. Residents became more attentive to the spaces around them, more empathetic toward neighbors, and more engaged in civic life. The story of Elmwood Street demonstrated that justice was not only a function of law enforcement and legal proceedings, but also of ordinary citizens paying attention, acting responsibly, and having the courage to step forward when something seemed amiss. The Thompsons also took time to reflect privately on the ethical weight of their actions. Their accidental discovery had been the catalyst for uncovering a decade-long crime, but it also came with a burden of awareness. They were intimately connected to the lives of Nathaniel and Anton, to the families who had suffered, and to the unfolding legal process. Michael often sat quietly in the evenings, contemplating the fragility of human life and the way ordinary decisions could intersect with fate in profound ways. Emma wrote in journals, capturing reflections about morality, responsibility, and the interconnectedness of people and events, preserving insights that might guide future generations in understanding courage, empathy, and vigilance. Years passed, and the memory of Elmwood Street remained present but no longer overwhelming. The Thompsons continued to live in Charleston, engaged in their community, raising lion, and sharing the lessons learned from their experience. Margaret Brooks found stability and a sense of peace, though her sorrow was never entirely gone. Alina Volkov's foundation grew modestly, providing opportunities for young people and honoring the memory of her brother. Detective Ramirez remained in touch with the families, checking in periodically, a steady presence that symbolized the intersection of justice, persistence, and humanity. Elmwood Street itself, now lined with new homes and familiar routines, served as a quiet monument to the events that had unfolded. The ordinary street had been a stage for extraordinary revelations, and the memory of what had been uncovered continued to influence those who lived there. The story was told, retold, and reflected upon, a reminder of the enduring power of truth, the consequences of hidden actions, and the importance of moral courage. Residents carried the memory as a kind of quiet respect, acknowledging the fragility of life and the impact one ordinary act can have on the world. Ultimately, the legacy of Elmwood Street extended beyond the courtroom and the immediate aftermath. It became a narrative of resilience, ethical action, and human connection. Lives had been lost, but justice had been served. Grief had been profound, but remembrance and legacy offered paths toward healing. The Thompsons, the families, and the broader community had all been irrevocably shaped by the events. Yet in their continued engagement with memory, compassion, and civic responsibility, they ensured that the story of Elmwood Street remained a source of insight, reflection, and inspiration. Even as time softened the raw edges of grief, the lessons endured that vigilance matters, that courage and curiosity can illuminate hidden truths, and that the human capacity for empathy, action, and persistence can transform tragedy into recognition, justice, and legacy. Elmwood Street, the ordinary suburban street that had concealed so much, became a symbol not of horror alone, but of the enduring strength of truth and the profound ways in which ordinary people can influence the arc of justice. The story remained, alive in memory, in ritual, in community, and in the quiet reflections of those whose lives had intersected with its hidden history. Years had passed since the dramatic events on Elmwood Street, but their impact remained as vivid as ever in the minds of those who had been most directly involved. Michael and Emma Thompson had settled into a life that outwardly appeared ordinary. Lime had grown taller, more curious, and increasingly aware of the stories that had shaped his early childhood. Yet beneath the surface, the memory of that first swing of the sledgehammer, the dust, the darkness behind the fireplace, lingered in their consciousness. It had been a moment that had irrevocably altered their understanding of the fragility of life, the hidden narratives within familiar spaces, and the unforeseen consequences of even small actions. They often reflected on the role they had played, not by choice but by circumstance, in uncovering a truth that had been buried for more than a decade. The Thompsons maintained an ongoing connection with the Brooks and Volkov families, a quiet bond forged through shared grief, empathy, and the extraordinary circumstances of the case. Margaret Brooks, who had endured 10 years of uncertainty, now focused on honoring Nathaniel's memory through public speaking and community outreach. She spoke at schools, neighborhood groups, and civic organizations, emphasizing the importance of awareness, moral courage, and the power of persistence in seeking truth. Her story resonated with listeners, particularly those who had never considered how ordinary actions could intersect with extraordinary events. Michael and Emma occasionally accompanied her, offering practical support and sharing their perspective on the accidental discovery that had initiated the chain of events leading to justice. Anton Volkov's family had also embraced a form of lasting legacy. Alina Volkov had expanded the small scholarship she had established in Anton's name, creating opportunities for young people pursuing trades and skilled labor. It became a platform not only to honor Anton's talents, but also to instill the values of responsibility, dedication, and integrity in the next generation. Community members participated actively, contributing resources and volunteering to mentor students, ensuring that Anton's story remained a living influence rather than a static memory. For the Volkov family, the scholarship was a way to transform pain into purpose, grief into action, and remembrance into a lasting, positive force. In the Thompsons' home, discussions often turned toward reflection and meaning. Emma and Michael taught Liam about the importance of vigilance, ethics, and empathy, framing the story of Elmwood Street as a lesson in human responsibility. They emphasized that courage could take many forms: asking questions, noticing discrepancies, speaking up when something feels wrong, and that ordinary actions could have profound consequences. Liam absorbed these lessons, sometimes asking difficult questions, sometimes simply observing. The family navigated these conversations carefully, balancing truth with the need to preserve childhood innocence, shaping Liam's understanding of morality, justice, and the value of attentive awareness in everyday life. Elmwood Street itself, though physically transformed, retained a memory in the collective consciousness of the neighborhood. The house had been demolished and replaced, but conversations, recollections, and quiet nods between neighbors ensured that the story was not forgotten. Children grew up hearing fragments of the tale, parents sharing it in hushed tones as a reminder of caution and awareness. For many, the story of the hidden fireplace and the eventual uncovering of long-buried crimes became more than a news item. It became a narrative of moral vigilance, community awareness, and the unpredictable ways in which ordinary life intersects with extraordinary events. Detective Alina Ramirez remained an enduring figure in the ongoing reflection on the Elmwood Street case. Though years had passed since the trial, she continued to share her insights with colleagues, mentoring younger officers on the importance of careful observation, ethical investigation, and the patient accumulation of evidence. The case became emblematic of the power of diligence and the responsibility that accompanies discovering a truth that affects real human lives. Ramirez often thought of the Thompsons, the families, and the countless small details that had contributed to a successful resolution, reflecting on how a combination of chance, attention, and moral courage had ultimately brought closure. As the years continued, the families developed new routines and rituals to honor Nathaniel and Anton. Margaret Brooks often visited Nathaniel's grave, leaving flowers, speaking softly about her life, and recounting milestones he would have reached. Similarly, Alina Volkov dedicated time each week to maintaining Anton's scholarship, personally engaging with students, and witnessing the ripple effect of her brother's life continuing through others. These acts of remembrance were not just symbolic. They were dynamic engagements that ensured the memory of the victims remained active, meaningful, and generative. Through these rituals, the families converted grief into something enduring, ensuring that the lives lost would continue to shape and inspire those who remained. For the Thompsons, the process of long-term reflection included recognizing the ways in which Elmwood Street had altered their own lives. Michael often thought about the randomness of circumstance, the decision to renovate a fireplace, the coincidental uncovering of a decade-old secret, and marveled at the unexpected role it had assigned to their family. The experience had instilled in them a heightened awareness of the world around them, a deeper understanding of human fragility, and a recognition of the profound consequences that ordinary decisions can yield. Their lives were forever intertwined with a narrative that belonged initially to strangers, yet had become a permanent part of their consciousness. Community life also bore the mark of Elmwood Street. Local residents engaged in discussions about safety, vigilance, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. Civic organizations used the story as a case study for ethical responsibility, fostering awareness that even in ordinary settings, extraordinary truths might exist, waiting for discovery. The narrative became embedded in Charleston's collective memory, serving as both a cautionary tale and an example of moral perseverance. In this way, the story transcended individual grief, entering a broader cultural consciousness as a story of accountability, courage, and resilience. Years later, Michael and Emma occasionally revisited Elmwood Street, walking along the familiar sidewalk, observing the new homes, the manicured lawns, and the quiet street that now seemed ordinary, yet remained steeped in memory. They reflected on the entwining of their lives with the lives of Nathaniel and Anton, understanding that their accidental intervention had shaped justice, remembrance, and the moral arc of the community. Each visit was contemplative, a mixture of somber reflection and gratitude for the resilience displayed by the families, the community, and even themselves in navigating an extraordinary intersection of human experience. In private moments, they shared stories with Liam about courage, integrity, and the unexpected ways that ordinary people can influence the course of events. They emphasized the importance of speaking truth, noticing injustice, and taking action when circumstances demand it. These lessons, derived from real events, were living examples of the moral responsibility that accompanies awareness, curiosity, and attention to detail. Liam, growing into adolescence, began to internalize these values, understanding not only the story itself, but the principles it represented: vigilance, empathy, and moral courage. Ultimately, Elmwood Street became more than a location. It became a symbol of the enduring interplay between chance, human action, and justice. The Thompsons, the Brooks family, the Volkov family, and the broader community had all been irrevocably shaped by a series of events that began with a simple act of curiosity. Over time, they had woven these experiences into their lives, creating legacies, rituals, and teachings that ensured the story endured beyond immediate grief and tragedy. The narrative was no longer solely about the crimes committed, but about the resilience, moral courage, and attentive awareness that allowed truth to emerge, even from the most hidden corners of ordinary life. In the quiet evenings of Charleston, the memory of Elmwood Street remained alive in thought, ritual, and conversation. Lives had been lost, but justice had been served. Grief had been profound, yet it had been transformed into remembrance and legacy. Ordinary people had acted with curiosity and courage, law enforcement had pursued truth with diligence, and the community had embraced the lessons of vigilance and empathy. The story of Elmwood Street, while rooted in darkness, became a lasting testament to the power of human action, the endurance of memory, and the transformative potential of truth. Years had passed since the events on Elmwood Street, yet the memory of that quiet Charleston neighborhood, and the dark secrets it once held, remained vivid for those who had been involved. Michael and Emma Thompson often reflected on the chain of moments that had begun with a simple decision to renovate an old fireplace, and had cascaded into a series of revelations that changed lives forever. What had initially seemed like a mundane weekend project had become the catalyst for uncovering truths that had remained buried for over a decade, altering the course of justice, shaping the lives of families, and leaving an indelible mark on the community. They understood now, more than ever, that ordinary actions could carry extraordinary consequences, that attention to detail, curiosity, and courage were not merely virtues but lifelines in a world where darkness often hides in plain sight. For the Thompsons, life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, yet they carried within them a heightened awareness of human fragility. Everyday decisions were now tinged with reflection, a recognition that ordinary moments could intersect with hidden narratives in ways that were impossible to predict. Emma would often pause while cleaning or organizing the house, catching herself thinking of how Nathaniel Brooks and Anton Volkov had been erased from sight, hidden behind walls, and left unacknowledged for so long. Michael shared these reflections quietly, noting how much their lives had been shaped by empathy, awareness, and the moral imperative to act when faced with uncertainty. Even Liam, now older and more perceptive, had begun to internalize these lessons, understanding that vigilance, courage, and honesty were essential not only in extraordinary circumstances but in everyday life. The Brooks and Volkov families had, in their own ways, found a measure of peace. Margaret Brooks continued her visits to Nathaniel's grave, speaking softly about his life, his accomplishments, and the moments he might have experienced had his life not been stolen. These visits, though tinged with sorrow, were also acts of remembrance and affirmation, rituals that allowed her to honor her son while accepting the permanence of loss. Alina Volkov, meanwhile, had grown the scholarship in Anton's name into a program that provided tangible opportunities for young people, transforming grief into purpose and ensuring that Anton's legacy continued to influence the world in meaningful ways. For both families, the process of honoring the past became intertwined with acts of moral engagement, a way to channel sorrow into constructive action. Michael and Emma often participated in community discussions about the lessons of Elmwood Street, sharing insights with neighbors, schools, and civic groups. They spoke about the importance of vigilance, of noticing irregularities, and of the moral responsibility to act when faced with uncertainty. The story of Elmwood Street was no longer merely a narrative of crime and discovery. It had become a teaching tool, a moral compass for the community, demonstrating the interplay between ordinary decisions and extraordinary consequences. It reminded people that courage is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, persistent, and rooted in the willingness to pay attention. Detective Elena Ramirez reflected on the case with a sense of professional satisfaction, tempered by the somber recognition of the human cost. The meticulous investigation, the careful collection of evidence, and the courage of witnesses like Irina Petrova had made justice possible. Yet Ramirez knew that the real significance extended beyond courtroom victories. It lay in the way ordinary people, the Thompsons, the neighbors who had recalled small details, and the families who had persisted in hope, collectively ensured that long-buried truths were revealed. Justice, she realized, is rarely the product of one person alone, and it is the convergence of curiosity, persistence, and moral courage across multiple lives. Over time, the rebuilt Elmwood Street became emblematic of renewal. The new houses were modern, with open spaces and clean lines, but the story of the neighborhood's past continued to resonate. Residents spoke of the events quietly, as reminders that life is fragile and that the world often contains hidden layers beneath ordinary appearances. The narrative served both as a cautionary tale and an inspiration that awareness, ethical action, and vigilance can transform tragedy into understanding and eventually into justice. For those who lived there, the legacy of Elmwood Street was embedded not just in memory, but in behavior, relationships, and community values. For the Thompsons, the moral lessons were personal as much as communal. They had been thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and through that experience, they had learned about the depth of human cruelty, but also about the resilience and courage of ordinary people. They understood that moral responsibility often arises unexpectedly, requiring decisions that are neither easy nor comfortable. Emma and Michael instilled these principles in Liam, teaching him not only about the story itself, but about the values it represented: vigilance, empathy, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. These lessons became part of the fabric of their family life, shaping the way they approached both ordinary choices and unforeseen challenges. The community also benefited from a broader awareness of the delicate balance between vigilance and empathy. Conversations in schools, civic meetings, and casual gatherings increasingly included reflections on ethical responsibility, noticing irregularities, and taking action when something seems wrong. Elmwood Street's story demonstrated that ordinary spaces and ordinary people are not immune to extraordinary events, and that paying attention, questioning discrepancies, and acting with integrity can have profound consequences. The narrative became part of the community's collective consciousness, a subtle moral framework guiding behavior and encouraging compassion, awareness, and responsibility. Years later, Michael and Emma would occasionally walk down Elmwood Street, pausing near the site of the old Thompson home. The physical structure had changed, but the memory remained vivid, a silent reminder of the intersection between human lives, moral responsibility, and the pursuit of justice. They reflected on the series of events that had begun with a single, ordinary action and had cascaded into a story of revelation, accountability, and moral consequence. It was a story they carried with them, quietly, persistently, and responsibly, understanding that the weight of witnessing history required not only observation, but also reflection and moral engagement. Ultimately, the story of Elmwood Street became more than a local legend or a dramatic narrative. It evolved into a meditation on human behavior, responsibility, and the enduring consequences of action and inaction. Lives had been lost, but the truth had been revealed. Grief had been profound, yet had been transformed into remembrance, legacy, and moral insight. Ordinary people had been placed in extraordinary circumstances, and their choices had ensured that justice prevailed. The community, families, and the Thompsons all learned that courage is sometimes quiet and persistent, that justice is rarely instantaneous, and that memory and reflection are essential for understanding and growth. In quiet moments, long after the trial and funerals, the Thompsons, the Brooks family, and the Volkov family would sit with their thoughts, reflecting on the lessons of Elmwood Street. They recognized the fragility of life, the unseen threads that connect people across time and circumstance, and the way courage and moral action can illuminate truths that might otherwise remain hidden. Elmwood Street, once a seemingly ordinary neighborhood, had become a symbol of vigilance, resilience, and the enduring power of truth. It was a story that reminded everyone involved that justice, memory, and moral responsibility are intertwined, and that ordinary actions, guided by conscience and courage, can leave a lasting legacy. Years had softened the raw edges of Elmwood Street, yet the story of that quiet Charleston neighborhood remained alive in the hearts of those who had been involved. The Thompsons had long since moved to a new home, one with no dark history, no hidden corners. Yet the memory of what had been uncovered, the human remains concealed behind a fireplace. The lives of Nathaniel Brooks and Anton Volkov remained vivid, shaping their perspectives and their sense of moral responsibility. Michael often reflected on how a simple act, the decision to renovate a fireplace, could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict, touching lives, altering destinies, and leaving an indelible mark on an entire community. The story had transformed from a moment of accidental discovery into a lasting lesson in vigilance, empathy, and courage. For the Brooks and Volkov families, time brought both healing and reflection. Margaret Brooks continued to visit Nathaniel's grave, carrying flowers, photographs, and the quiet conversation of a mother speaking to a son she had lost too early. The grief never disappeared, but it became tempered by the knowledge that justice had been served, that the man responsible for his death had been held accountable, and that Nathaniel's life had been remembered, honored, and celebrated. Elena Volkov nurtured the scholarship in Anton's name, transforming tragedy into opportunity, grief into legacy. Young students who had never known the men personally benefited from the program, and through their work, Anton's passion and dedication lived on. Both families had found ways to turn loss into purpose, to convert sorrow into enduring impact, and to ensure that their loved ones would continue to shape the world even in absence. The Thompsons, meanwhile, found a quiet understanding of their role in the story. They had acted not out of heroism, but curiosity and initiative. And yet those ordinary decisions had triggered the uncovering of a decade-long secret. Emma and Michael taught Liam, now older and thoughtful, about integrity, vigilance, and moral courage, framing their lessons in terms he could grasp. They emphasized that ordinary people can influence extraordinary outcomes, that noticing discrepancies and acting responsibly can have profound effects, and that living with awareness and empathy is itself a form of justice. Liam absorbed these lessons with a child's curiosity, carrying forward the values of conscience, courage, and attentiveness that had shaped the lives of all involved. Elmwood Street itself had changed physically, but remained charged with memory. The house where the remains had been discovered was demolished, replaced with a modern structure devoid of past shadows. Yet the neighborhood retained the story in whispers, in casual conversations, and in the quiet respect of those who remembered. It became a place where ordinary citizens reflected on the fragile boundaries between appearance and reality, on the hidden narratives that can exist in seemingly mundane spaces. The story was recounted carefully to younger generations, not as a tale of fear but as a reminder that vigilance, integrity, and moral courage are necessary in both ordinary and extraordinary circumstances. Detective Elena Ramirez, years removed from the direct investigation, still carried Elmwood Street in her consciousness. She shared its lessons with colleagues, mentoring new detectives on the importance of patient observation, meticulous evidence collection, and moral responsibility. The case became emblematic of the convergence of ordinary human action with extraordinary consequence, illustrating how curiosity, empathy, and integrity can collectively illuminate hidden truths. Ramirez reflected on the courage of witnesses, the perseverance of families, and the fortuitous intervention of the Thompsons. Understanding that justice is never a solitary pursuit, but a tapestry woven from multiple acts of awareness and bravery, the neighborhood, over time, embraced a quiet resilience. Residents, once startled by the events, now spoke of them in reflective tones, internalizing the story as a lesson in observation, responsibility, and community care. Civic groups and local organizations occasionally referenced Elmwood Street in discussions about ethics, safety, and moral vigilance. Schools incorporated the narrative into lessons on integrity and the importance of paying attention to the world around them. The story became more than a crime narrative. It evolved into a cultural memory, a shared lesson, and a symbol of the potential for ordinary citizens to effect extraordinary outcomes through awareness and action. For the Thompsons, returning to the site occasionally became an act of reflection, rather than confrontation. Walking past the modern houses, observing the neat lawns and quiet streets, they recalled the first moment of discovery: the dust, the hollow behind the fireplace, the shock and disbelief, and marveled at how a seemingly small, mundane act had intertwined their lives with a larger narrative of hidden truths, accountability, and human resilience. These walks became opportunities to reflect not only on the fragility of safety and routine, but also on the moral lessons that persisted long after the immediate danger had passed. Margaret Brooks and Alina Volkov found ways to honor memory through ritual and engagement. Margaret spoke at community events, sharing her experiences to encourage empathy and moral awareness. Elena's scholarship program expanded, mentoring students, providing guidance, and celebrating human creativity and effort in tribute to Anton. These acts were not merely commemorative, they were transformative, allowing the legacies of Nathaniel and Anton to influence future generations in tangible ways. Through remembrance and purposeful action, the families ensured that the lives lost would continue to inspire, guide, and shape ethical awareness in their community. The Thompsons' home life carried these lessons into ordinary moments as well. Emma and Michael integrated reflection into family routines, teaching Liam the importance of observation, moral action, and courage in the face of uncertainty. They framed discussions around empathy, accountability, and vigilance in ways that resonated with his growing understanding of the world. By embedding these values into daily life, they ensured that the story of Elmwood Street remained not only a memory, but a set of guiding principles that could shape moral character, decision-making, and attentiveness to both the visible and hidden realities around them. Over time, the community as a whole integrated Elmwood Street into its cultural consciousness. It became a story about the interplay between ordinary decisions and extraordinary consequences, the importance of vigilance, and the power of collective moral courage. Families discussed it as an example of the significance of paying attention, noticing when something is amiss, and acting responsibly. Neighborhoods embraced awareness not out of fear, but out of understanding that human lives, hidden truths, and justice can intersect unexpectedly, requiring attentiveness, courage, and empathy. Ultimately, Elmwood Street became a symbol of both caution and resilience. It reminded those who lived there that ordinary people can influence the course of justice, that hidden narratives exist in all communities, and that human courage, attention, and integrity can illuminate truths that might otherwise remain concealed. The Thompsons, the Brooks family, the Volkov family, and the wider community had all been irrevocably shaped by the events. Yet they had transformed tragedy into learning, grief into purpose, and memory into enduring legacy. In the quiet evenings of Charleston, as the sun cast long shadows over the neighborhood, the story of Elmwood Street lingered not as a tale of horror alone, but as a reflection of human resilience, moral responsibility, and the transformative power of awareness and action. The legacy of those events endured, woven into the memories of families, the practices of the community, and the consciousness of ordinary people whose decisions can ripple across time. Elmwood Street had revealed not only hidden truths, but also the enduring strength of courage, justice, and empathy, leaving a mark that would persist far beyond the moment of discovery and the conclusion of legal proceedings. If you enjoy stories that make you think twice before turning off the lights, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are still many things left unsaid, and we'll continue exploring them together.